Good evening, all. Thank you for coming for the talk today. Um, Today, the speaker is Dr. Nisha Matthew, and she will be speaking on oil, oil cities, and gold in Dubai. I'll just give a brief description of Dr. Nisha Matthew. She's a Joint Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Asia Research Institute in the National University of Singapore. She received a PhD in history from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where her research explored the methodological possibilities of Indian Ocean studies in the making of a contemporary urban space as Dubai. Currently, she is working on her book entitled 24 Carat Cities, Gold Smuggling and Mobility in the Western Indian Ocean. And it tells the story of Dubai's rise to prominence as a 21st century global city, with gold as the protagonist. Dr. Nisha, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Imad, and thank you all for coming. I actually want to begin with a map. Now, if you look carefully at this map, this was a map created by the British government's Foreign Office in 1945, and it looks at the Middle East as a concessionary geography rather than as a region, with states and with clearly defined national borders. So the context in which this map was created was, the end of the World War, the impending, winding up of the British Empire, and the possibility of a conflict in the future between Saudi and Iran and all of that. Now, the Persian Gulf, which lies to the east, the region just, the point is the red one. Okay. Yeah. So this part, the Persian Gulf, was incorporated as part of the Middle East in this map. And that actually marks the turning point of history in the Persian Gulf and the way in which we understand the history of the Persian Gulf. So until the Persian Gulf was incorporated into the Middle East, it was governed from India, and it was more a part of the Bombay Presidency in Western India, which was under the colonial government. And with this, with concessionary regimes coming into play in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf became actually a part of the Middle East, or so in the Anglo-American imagination. Since oil concessions were key to deciding the fate of the Middle East, the British and the Americans knew that the national borders and the political aspirations of the people in these different regions would not really coincide. This was clearly visible by 1968 when the British announced its plans to withdraw militarily from all posts east of the Suez. Overnight, the security and stability of the Middle East, particularly the Persian Gulf, became its defining feature for the Americans, the singular problem over which they began to lose much sleep through the following decades. Intelligence officers associated with the Middle Eastern Department in the US set to work to report back to the President's office details about the existing power equations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the ways in which the other sheikdoms, excluding Kuwait, which had become independent in 1961, and Oman as well, could possibly be drawn into the ambit of these two big players, which is Saudi and Iran. The plan that Britain had and the US agreed on was to create a Federation of Arab Emirates, or FAA as it was called, out of the left behind players, which are the 7 emirates of the present day UAE, Dubai including, and Bahrain and Qatar. Um, the US even had plans to set up a foreign office in Dubai. So this was the 1960s. Once Britain decided to leave in 1968, there was this anxiety in the late 1960s. An interesting observation these intelligence officers made in their reports was the regional ambitions of Zayed, the chief of Abu Dhabi, who later went on to become the first president of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. They believed that his regional ambitions did not bode well for the US and for the region in general. You could not have three ambitious regional players in the Middle East. You couldn't have Saudi, Iran, and Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, with the largest reserves spread over a vast territory in the desert and the sea, they feared would possibly try to dominate other emirates, leading to feuds and skirmishes as in the days before oil. Abu Dhabi did have a reputation, along with the other emirates in the Persian Gulf, of being a piratical port, as the British, called it. In any case, the Americans and the Europeans could not have them go back to their piratical ways, since any attack on maritime shipping or any untoward incident at oil wells would mean the disruption of global industry and trade. Middle East oil was important for Japan because 90% of Japan's oil came from this region. It was important for Western Europe for its reconstruction after the war. And it was also important for the US because the oil that was required for US activities in Southeast Asia went from this region at the time. But as we all know, the Federation of Arab Emirates did not come into existence. Bahrain and Qatar went their own ways, and Abu Dhabi consolidated all the remaining sheikdoms under the federation called the UAE. But did the UAE give up on its regional ambitions? Not really. We do not, however, see such regional ambitions play out until after the events that led to Dubai's financial bailout in Abu Dhabi by Abu Dhabi in 2009, and we also did not see such regional ambitions consolidate following the developments of the Arab Spring in 2011. But this time, Abu Dhabi seems to be getting it right. It was not any kind of a random political aspiration to dominate that kind of sent Abu Dhabi into the region with its military projects and other things. Much has changed in the course of 40 years, and it has enabled, these 40 years have enabled Abu Dhabi to shape regionalism as a strategy. It's not just military prowess or aid in the poor regions of the Middle East, but it is actually leveraged on a long-term strategy. And to understand this long-term strategy, we need to shift our gaze a little and, move to the... I actually started talking and missed the slides. We actually need to move to Dubai and understand Dubai's urban history in the mid-20th century. And we need to understand it from a slightly different perspective. That's from the perspective of South Asia or India. Because if you look at regular historical accounts of Dubai in official media, or there have been lots of books written about Dubai in the early years of the millennium, you would see different landmarks and milestones as key moments in Dubai's historical growth. So you have the establishment of the Emirates airline, the opening of the Jebel Ali port, which was in 1979, Emirates, which was launched in 1985, 1996, you have the Dubai Shopping Festival. These are the key events that mark Dubai's history. But I'm going to talk about Dubai's history in a slightly different way. And this is why we have this clipping here. It's a report published in the Times of India in 1971. And as you can see, the key player here is gold. So what the article broadly says is that, Dubai became a thriving sheikhdom thanks to gold smuggling into India. Now, gold smuggling is a problem that has been identified by Indians, Indian economists in particular, as a national problem with economic and political repercussions. And so there was a lot of moral outrage against smugglers and, the Arab sheikdoms and all of that. Because in the immediate post-colonial context, you had the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru of the Congress actually putting in a policy of import substitution and domestic manufacturing and promotion of exports, and therefore gold was banned. The import of gold into India was banned. The domestic price of gold was 8 times higher than the price in the international market. But we must also understand the international market in terms of regulations and restrictions on the sale of gold for non-monetary purposes. So central banks could transact in gold, but not private players. And the price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce. So in India, it was selling at 8 times $35 an ounce, which is roughly, I don't know. Yeah, so, and that gold came in from Dubai. Now, one could actually look at gold smuggling from the perspective of the Indian, insatiable appetite for gold, because you couldn't have a marriage without gold, or you couldn't celebrate a child's birth without gold and all of that. Now, in the context of partition in 1947 and the creation of Pakistan, there was also another argument that was launched. That is, the Pakistani state, or Pakistanis, were out there to, get India, and therefore gold smuggling was a part of their economic and political project of sabotage, because there were lots of Pakistanis too, besides Arabs and Indians themselves, involved in the actual act of smuggling. Now, if you look at all of these arguments, there's a fundamental flaw here. They all theorize gold smuggling with the notion that, gold smuggling is basically a violation of national borders, and that the economy is a singular unit that is contained within the territorial borders, be it of India or Pakistan. The problem is that, now, if you look at this map, you'd see the Persian Gulf, and you'd see the western coast of India. Now, it was not just Dubai's free trade policy that resulted in gold smuggling, but it was a set of social networks in this in the Western Indian Ocean, or more precisely the Arabian Sea, that kind of propped up gold smuggling. So what I am arguing is that you should not look at gold smuggling as an isolated phenomenon in Bombay, which was, do you see Bombay here? Yeah. You shouldn't look at gold smuggling as an isolated phenomenon in Dubai or in Bombay, but you should look at it as a phenomenon that links multiple cities within this geography. And this is not a part of the national economy of India or Pakistan or, the Persian Gulf. And it's not a part of the international economy as well. It's a part of what I call the trans-regional economy. So you have Bombay, you have Dubai, and then you have, towards the south, it's not marked here, but it's called Kerala or Malabar, which was also part of this economy. If there's something that the gold trade in the Arabian Sea can teach us, is that new nation states carved out of the empire, out of the British Empire, were often not successful in deciding the shape of their economies. Bombay, Dubai, Bahrain, Sharjah, Muscat, Karachi, Aden, Gujarat, and Malabar were all part of an older world of trade and exchange in the Indian Ocean, with merchant networks connecting them. Some of these networks went back several centuries. These merchant networks of Indians, particularly, the Gujaratis and Sindhis, who came from the western part of India, if you look at um, the Surat region all the way up to Bombay, but they had their dominance all across the Western Indian Ocean, uh, all across the western coast of India, leading all the way up to East Africa. Um, During the colonial period, these merchant networks became deeply entrenched within all these port towns that I was talking about, all the way from Malabar to Karachi and then across the Persian Gulf. They financed the pearl trade and, in that sense, were part of the imperial strategy to discipline the maritime Arabs, whom the British classified as pirates, disrupting shipping and trade in the Western Indian Ocean. Financing the pearl trade meant many things at once: advancing sums of money to pearling crews, engaging in the trade of foodstuff and textiles in these ports, and acting as go betweens with the sheikhs and the representatives of the colonial government in India. Since these merchants and their agents knew Arabic and had access to the sheikhs, the Bombay Presidency employed them as native agents and political assistants to the political resident, who was always a British officer. These Indian merchants were much more than instruments of Britain's imperial policy in the Persian Gulf. They used the imperial context and the privileges it brought them to establish their own foothold in the region and penetrate the social, political, and economic fabric of these port towns in ways that the British could not or cared little for. This was not a region that the British were particularly interested in because it was desert. It did not provide resources for trade, for their steamships and other big conglomerates. But the Indian merchants had much investment here. With India gaining independence, these merchant networks lost their nerve center in Bombay, from where they practically wielded the remote control over the Gulf ports. The changing economic conditions, spurred by oil in a region that was unstable and feared prone to Russian intervention, Iranian assault, and popular uprisings against the rulers, also affected the position of these Indian merchants in the Gulf ports. With elaborate social security measures meant to stabilize the region and a restricted notion of citizenship in the GCC states, these merchants became outsiders within these Gulf societies. Dubai remained an exception, though. Dubai needed them because it did not have enough oil to flex its economic muscle on its own terms. And so these Indian merchants reoriented their networks around gold and with Dubai as the center. Dubai capitalized on the imperial connections that these Indian merchants brought with them as they shifted base to the city, and so what I call the trans-regional economy of gold smuggling in the Arabian Sea was born. This trans-regional economy was actually consolidated in three phases. So here you have the dough ports, all the ports that I was referring to earlier. So by the mid 20th century, after the winding up of the British Empire and partition in India, this economy kind of shrunk and it became a triangle of sorts with the southwestern tip of India reaching all the way up to Bombay and then to Dubai. These lines kind of got displaced when the map was magnified, but that's mostly the shape of this economy. Um, yeah. So this economy kind of got its contours only with the beginning of the Indian independence and later. So you can study the history of this economy in three phases. So the first phase, you have the older pearl merchants, who are mostly the Sindhis and the Gujaratis, shifting base from Bombay to Dubai. So these merchants were in Muscat, were in Sharjah, Dubai, etc. for a long time, maybe from the 18th and 19th centuries, in Dubai towards the end of the 19th century. Now, once they operated with Karachi, Bombay, and the other Gulf ports as their base. But like I said, with independence, when they lost Karachi, most of them moved to um, Bombay from Sindh, which went over to Pakistan. So Karachi is actually in Sindh, if you look at it. They moved to Bombay and then they went back to the Persian Gulf and they consolidated their business around Dubai instead of Bombay. So that was the first phase. Um, like I said, these merchants were very, very influential people. They had connections in London, from where they basically imported gold. Beirut and Kuwait were also active centers of gold trading at the time, because uh, there were restrictions in the Anglo-American agreement on oil trade and cooperation after war. That London was the biggest gold market, but they weren't allowed to privately trade gold. But because these merchants were influential and Indian merchants were influential, they could actually use their connections to get bullion dealers in London to send them gold. Beirut was the region where you had Lebanese syndicates, you also had Swiss syndicates, French cartels operating, because the French and the Swiss were not party to the agreement, what we call the Bretton Woods settlement, and they didn't have restrictions on gold trade in their countries. So the Indian merchants had connections with Beirut and London, and they got the gold to Dubai. Now, the next phase was the 1950s to the 1960s. Now, the first set of merchants were the people who had relationships, who had connections in the Persian Gulf even before Indian independence, like I said, going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. But you also had a new set of people coming in from Sindh, which was lost to Pakistan, and other players from Bombay who were kind of riding the wave that these older merchant networks had established. So you had the people coming in into Dubai, Sindhis and other people coming into Dubai from Bombay. This was the second phase, the 1950s and the 60s. This was also the time when steam shipping between Bombay and the Persian Gulf was restored after the war. Because during the war, all these steamer services were, called to war service. Many of them were refitted as hospitals, and others were used to carry soldiers, and passenger services were terminated. But in the 1950s, they were restored, and passenger services kind of helped move these people, the new set of merchants or entrepreneurs, let's say, because they didn't really have the capital to begin with. And they started, energizing this gold smuggling. So the first set of traders brought gold from London and Beirut and Kuwait into Dubai, and these people actually used the shipping services to transport this gold from Dubai into Bombay. So they were mostly deck passengers. Besides gold, they also carried goods that, if you go to Mustafa in Little India, you will see all these Bangladeshi traders buying particular categories of goods, things that are very popular: Nivea, Cream 21, blankets, particular kinds of, now it's mobile phones, but in those days it was radio sets, National Panasonic and other kinds of things. So the first set of merchants had licenses in Dubai to import these goods as well from Japan because of the trade between oil trade between UAE and Japan. So they had those import licenses, and they imported them because they knew that the second set of merchants would carry these on the ships back to India along with gold. So this is the second phase. Now the third phase is actually the phase when you have the Malayalis from Kerala or from Malabar, which is the southernmost part, move to Dubai. We don't look at it generally as part of the smuggling networks, we look at them as labor migrants. This has been the discourse generally, because by the uh, late 60s, early 70s, all the Gulf states are producing oil in saleable quantities, and they needed all these migrants to build their economy. So these people moved into Dubai as labor migrants, but they were actively part of the smuggling networks, because it's like this. So you had the first set of merchants switch from pearl to gold and other kinds of electronic goods, textiles, etc. You have the second set of merchants joining them, carrying the gold back into India. So they kind of spin together the networks, and they kind of reinforce the circuit in very, very strong ways. But because the government in India was kind of increasing surveillance, and there were greater cases of interception in the waters, because all these there were lots of those too, the native vessels carrying gold. You needed to kind of have a you needed to have people to kind of constantly you couldn't really have permanent players, because they would be under the radar. So you needed to replace your carriers, or your couriers as they were called, with new sets of people. And that was where the labor migration from Kerala kind of helped the Sindhi merchants. So many of these people, those, by the way, were active until the late 70s in the Gulf. So it was a vehicle of illegal migration, because they carried, they smuggled human beings from Kerala, all the way, not just Kerala, but all the way up to Bombay, them to Dubai. And because these people did not have networks, unlike the Sindhi merchants, or they did not have capital to begin with, sometimes they did not even have the qualification to kind of work in an oil company or engineering firms and other things. They were the ideal recruits, to kind of take the goods back, take the gold back to India. So they took the gold to India, and in return they would get, a visa, a legal visa, a passport, etc. So they could go back to Dubai and find a new job or set up shop or some such thing. So this was the third phase. Now the Sindhis defined this economy, like I said, with their networks of capital. The pearl traders had made their wealth. The next set of merchants followed in their footsteps. And the second set of merchants actually had the early bird advantage, because by 1970s, this was becoming a very, very crowded sort of an industry. There were lots of players in Bombay. It led to a lot of crime, violence, and the story goes on. The the Malayalis, or the people from Kerala, who were mostly the labor migrants, were classified by Indian newspapers as amateur smugglers. They were not professional smugglers, they were amateur smugglers, because they did it randomly, maybe once or twice in return for, a ticket or a visa or whatever else. Now, as more and more people, but this was also happening alongside the regular migration of educated accountants, nurses, engineers, etc., who found jobs in the oil economy in Dubai and other parts of the Gulf. As more and more people, gold and goods flowed between Dubai, Bombay, and Malabar, this trans-regional economy flourished, and all three places grew wealthy. Not in equal terms, but all three places benefited from this phenomenon. This economy provided the social basis for Dubai's urban growth in the late 1990s and the 2000s, the time when Dubai begins to attract the attention once again of the West. So, what we have projected as the Dubai model begins, if you like, only from the late 90s, because, like I said, it's a time when you have landmarks and milestones to map Dubai's progress. Before that, you kind of have nothing. You just have people going in and out, in and out, and you do not have anything tangible to kind of document as part of its history. But this is another way of writing history. Um, so 2000s, you have the beginning of what is called Brand Dubai. Now, Brand Dubai is you have Burj Al Arab, you have all the real estate projects. One, kind of outsmarting the other, if you like. All the superlatives that can be applied: the tallest, the highest, the biggest, the first, etc., etc. That's the Dubai model that we recognize generally. And this was a model that was replicated in parts of the Middle East and South Asia. So you had MR going and building properties in Delhi, in Bombay, in Egypt, in Kuwait, and other places. So this is a phase in which Dubai was created piecemeal in other parts of Asia. But this was also an interesting deviation from Dubai's social base. So, like I said, this trans-regional economy of smuggling was Dubai's social basis for growth. But with the real estate economy kind of kicking in, Dubai kind of deviates from the social base and tries to kind of look towards the West and kind of attract Western investment from different places. This was the time of globalization, so Dubai had to kind of vie with many other places, including in the Western Asia, Singapore too, for investment. However, as its real estate economy came crashing down in 2009, and we know the story, so I don't want to probably get into it, Abu Dhabi had to bail it out financially. Now, this was the time when Abu Dhabi and Dubai both realized that Indians had much more than economic investments in the city. So, unlike the other foreigners who left following brief periods of, taking up a job or investment or whatever else, the Indians stayed on. So, it was not just an economic investment; they were culturally and socially invested in Dubai and other parts of the Gulf. Abu Dhabi, which had not been comfortable with Dubai's trajectory of growth since the earliest times of the Federation, was watching this closely and with much interest. So even when Dubai was setting up the Jebel Ali port in 1968, Abu Dhabi kind of distanced itself from this venture and said that this is a white elephant, Dubai doesn't really need it. So that was the equation between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But for the first time, when Abu Dhabi began to take note of the Indian approach to Dubai and the ways in which Indians were so deeply entrenched in its everyday life, its social fabric, Abu Dhabi realized that there is a strategy that it might be able to use for its regional ambitions. As the Arab Spring of 2011 began to pose a threat to regional stability, Abu Dhabi realized that it had to exceed its role as the leader of the Federation and step into the shoes of a regional player, particularly because the US could no longer be expected to do it. It had to use its wealth to further the cause of security for military purposes as well as for socially relevant projects such as education, healthcare, housing, etc. in the Middle East. And we know how it's playing out in the Horn of Africa, in the Red Sea, and other parts of the Gulf, more so in Bahrain and Oman and other places. While it spreads its resources beyond its national borders onto the regional canvas of the Middle East, it has to have a strategy for continued national growth. This is where Abu Dhabi can fall back on the Dubai model of urban growth. So the model that predates the real estate model of growth in Dubai. Abu Dhabi realized that Indians can be counted on to invest in Dubai and the rest of the Emirates. They can even be expected to take brand Dubai to many places as they have done in the 1990s and later. So brand Dubai is particularly visible in the case of gold. So if you again go to Little India, you'll see Malabar Gold, Joy Alucas. All of these establishments were actually started in Dubai, and at the time of the and at a time when gold smuggling was at its peak. So this is how Indians invest in Dubai. They set up shop in Dubai, and then they take Dubai elsewhere into the world. You see that in Singapore, you see that in the rest of the Gulf. You also see that in the US and the UK, where all these gold dwellers have chain stores. It's within this larger regional strategy of Abu Dhabi's that the Hindu temple, which you have in the abstract, I haven't put it in the slide, is scheduled to open in 2020. And it's the same time as the inauguration of the Dubai Expo. So if you have the Hindu temple in Dubai, what Abu Dhabi is banking on is that you'll have Indians from all over the world, from the US, from Australia, the Indian diaspora basically, come to Abu Dhabi to visit the temple, and that will boost tourism. It will also kind of coincide with the Dubai Expo, which means people moving in and out of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and other regions would bring, would bring revenue in the form of tourist taxes. They'll shop, they'll spend in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, all of those things. So this is a very nice complement to what Abu Dhabi has already been doing. So because of the low oil prices, it cannot forever push its welfare projects. So if you get Indians to come in and out and invest in Dubai, then part of this is taken care of. So this is Abu Dhabi's strategy, actually. Abu Dhabi's role then would be to pave the way and prepare the ground in the Middle East for Brand Dubai's regional march forward. So we should not just look at Abu Dhabi's regional ambitions in terms of its military projects and military capabilities. It's also with a long-term economic strategy in mind, which was developed by Dubai. So once you go into Yemen, once you go into the Horn of Africa and clear the ground militarily, it might actually be able to import the Dubai model of growth. You take Dubai's investors, including the Indian investors, and have them set up shop in these regions, lure more tourists into these regions. So it's kind of Abu Dhabi extending out beyond its national borders, using Dubai as its instrument. So this is basically Abu Dhabi's regionalism. I think I will end with that. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.